Thank you so much for coming today for our workshop. Just a quick request, if parents could please go in the back so that we have the seats for the girls, that would be great. I'm super excited to have Amy Caiazza here. She is a securities attorney at Sonsini. Thank you so much for coming. She came all the way from DC, but I think we gave her good weather, so it's all okay. So it would be great if you could just start by telling us a little bit about your background and how you got into law.
Sure. So one of the things about me that I think makes me unusual and that there are some lessons from is that this is a second career for me. And so you just always have to remember whatever you choose doesn't have to be a final decision, right? You can change mid-course. And so we'll talk about it in a little bit, but I actually started my career as a researcher. I have a doctorate in political science, and I spent about 10 years researching gender differences in political participation at a feminist think tank. I can talk about this in a little bit, but I kind of got frustrated with the work, and I decided to go back to school. I live in DC, and if you ever come to DC and work in DC, you'll realize that there is a lawyer about every third person. There's a lot of lawyers there. And a lot of my friends were doing really interesting things in the law, and so I decided to go back to school. I started working at a firm directly out of law school and got into the work that I do, which, again, I'll talk about in a second, but it's really fun, it's really unusual. I would never have picked it as something that I even knew existed, but it's been a great career as a lawyer, basically, thus far. And I graduated from law school in 2011, so I've been doing it about 9 years. Do you want me to follow up on?
And what was it like for you to go to law school? What was that process like?
So it was really fun, I'll say that. When you're in school, and I was in school as a kid like anybody else, and it's really hard, right? School is hard. It's fun because you're always learning, but there's a lot to do, and there's a lot of studying and that sort of thing. When I went back to school later, it was really different because it was totally my choice. It was something like it wasn't just expected that I would do it, and I loved being back in the classroom, especially with people who are like 15 years younger than me, because there was a lot of great energy, and it was fun debating ideas. All the stuff that are fun for me, anyways, about high school and college, I got to do again. It was a real luxury, but it was great. It was a little weird when I started interviewing for jobs because a lot of the people interviewing me were younger than me, and they were, I think, a little scared of what that would mean if I worked for them. But it was still fun. And then when I started practicing as a lawyer, it was also really fun because the ideas are so interesting. It's a profession that really requires you to be thinking and on your feet all the time and work with really interesting people. And so for that, all those reasons, it ended up being a great career for me.
And what was the journey like? What were sort of like taking the bar, spending, was it 7 years in law school? What was that like for you?
So law school's just 3 years, thankfully. 7 years if you do it right out of college, right? I mean, if you do college and then law school. So I was working at the think tank, and I took the LSAT, which is a standardized test you have to take to go to law school, which, I'm sure are you guys studying like for the SAT and the ACT right now? Some of you? Yeah, right. That part's not fun. It's exactly the same as doing the LSAT studying. Then, I applied to a variety of different law schools. I was living in the DC area, and my husband was working in the DC area, and my kids were there, so I knew I wasn't going to leave. So that meant I had not so many schools to choose from. I had to go someplace local. And went through the same process you guys will go through for applying to college. I was accepted, I went. Law school's 3 years. Usually it's really a little weird because after your first year, you apply for jobs between your first year and second year in the fall of your first year. And then in the fall of your second year, most people apply for jobs that will be their ultimate job. Not everyone does that, but you essentially do kind of an internship between your second and third year, and that becomes your job. And so like a year and a half in, your course is kind of falling into place already. Once you do that, then yes, after you graduate, you take the bar. The bar is like standardized testing writ large. I would rather take my rip my toenails off, I think, than do that again. It's really, really hard, but it's worth it. And it is just a matter of studying and making sure that you kind of have all kinds of different legal issues in your head so that you can answer these questions on the fly. And I passed the bar, thankfully, and I started working again in fall of 2011.
And what do you do now as a lawyer?
So I'm a securities lawyer, as you said, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means when we do the activity. But basically what I do is help companies that are issuing investments like stock and bonds and things like that comply with the law. And I also help companies that do things like serve as intermediaries in transactions in securities comply with the law. That probably sounds really boring, but it's actually really fun, and I'll talk about it, why it's fun in a bit. But my job is not the stereotypical lawyer. I don't go to courtrooms and advocate against in a case on one side or the other. I counsel my clients on the phone and on an ongoing basis. What's great about that is I have clients that I have had since my first September working. You're with them for the long haul. They're developing over time. You get really close relationships with them, which is really fun. The work at Wilson Sonsini, the firm I work for, one of our real focuses is on startups. And so I'm working a lot of times with people who are probably, a lot of you guys know a lot of people in startups, but who are really interesting and they've got innovative ideas and are kind of pushing the envelope. And what that means is that there's usually not an obvious answer to the questions that they're asking. And so I get to think on my feet a lot. And we also, in our group, there are about 10 lawyers in our group, we're always constantly debating and making sure we're kind of thinking about all of the different details that we need to be thinking about when we're making decisions about how to counsel our clients. So that's a lot of what I do. I like the counseling as opposed to the litigating because you do kind of get to hold on to your clients for a longer period of time. It's a little bit less, there's a little bit less conflict in your life. And for me, what I actually, just from a practical standpoint, like about it is that if you're litigating, you are completely on somebody else's schedule, i.e. the judges. Like there's a deadline for everything. Whereas my work is a little bit more, I have more control over my schedule. And especially because, I've got a family that kind of works much better with how my life is. So.
And what's the hardest part of being a lawyer?
For me, it's that I don't have any real easy days. When I was a researcher, there were days that I just was kind of brain dead and I would do things like check citations, just kind of half brain days. The hardest thing is that it's very constant because of the nature of what I do. It's always new questions. There's not a lot of days that you just kind of get to rest on your laurels and sit back. It's sort of constant. That's the good and the bad, right? But it's a constant set of intellectual puzzles that we have to solve.
So how do you keep yourself motivated?
Well, there is a lot of adrenaline in that. That's the part that's really fun too. And so when I get up in the morning, I usually have a list of things to do. I never do them all, but I usually have a list of things to do. They often involve writing or making some phone calls, doing that type of thing. But it's never boring. It's always fun that way and challenging. And so that's kind of what keeps me at it.
And so it seems like you really love law. How did you realize that this was the profession for you?
So I did speak with a lot of friends because I was kind of mid-career. I had a lot of friends that were my age that were also mid-career. And so I kind of spoke with a lot of them and said, what do you do and why do you like it? What's interesting about it? And again, because of where I live, a lot of people are lawyers, and what they were doing was sort of particular interest to me. One of the things about practicing law in DC too, and you could probably guess this, but a lot of people work for the government as attorneys. I work for a private firm, but you can work for, in my area, like the Securities Exchange Commission or Department of Treasury. And those are really good jobs, especially if you're really interested in thinking about regulation and how companies and others should be regulated. And so a lot of my friends now are sort of on the opposite side in that they work for these regulatory agencies. And also another great group of places to work as a lawyer are nonprofits in DC. There are a lot of advocacy organizations and policy organizations for which having a law degree is really great as well. So I spoke to all these people doing all these various things, and it just seemed like there were a lot of options at the end of it. There was a lot of really interesting work you could do on behalf of other people, and that's what convinced me to go to law school.
It seems really exciting.
It's fun, yeah.
Can you also tell us a little bit about the research that you did?
Yes, so the focus of my research at the think tank was gender differences in political participation. I did some work on like voting and gender differences in voting, but I also looked especially at social movements and how women's movements develop, and how women kind of think about their rights in society and use that as an inspiration to make change and to be involved in various types of advocacy and social movements. And it was really interesting work. Part of what I was supposed to be doing at the think tank was helping the women's movement think about what it should be doing and how we should be doing better, which was also fun. It was also very frustrating because there was a lot of debate sometimes, and sometimes that meant we weren't moving forward. But there were goods and bads to it. But the research I was really focused on trying to figure out ways to get women more involved in politics and social movements.
Takeaways for what you understood?
So one of the things I really focused on was how it is that women talk about what motivates them to be politically engaged. And a lot of times that really links to the values that are important to them. And sometimes that's things like equality. But what was interesting to me, and that I explored a lot, was how religion played a big role in that. And we often think of religion as being a very conservative motivator, the religious right, for example, in politics. But a lot of women whom I was researching would speak about their religious faith as an inspiration for their political movement, even among progressives. And so what I was looking at was sort of how that differs across the political spectrum, and how it also differs for women as opposed to men. And in a lot of ways, it's an area that people haven't focused on and haven't taken advantage of in terms of thinking about how to really resonate with women.
That's really interesting. So through all of this, what role has confidence played in your success?
Confidence is really important. And even now, I've been doing this for almost 10 years. I've been working and doing various things for 25 to 30 years. There are definitely times when I'm on a phone call or I'm talking to someone and there's a lot of self-doubt in there. It's really important to not get rid of that, because it's always good to be thinking about how you can do better and what might be wrong. But if you listen to that too much, then it keeps you from being decisive, it keeps you from moving forward, and it also doesn't inspire confidence in others necessarily. So for me, it's actually that's an ongoing process that I think lasts throughout your life, is making sure that you are continuing to have that confidence, and that you're kind of come out on the other side, intact and potentially glowing.
And what do you do in that moment when you're feeling self-doubt? How do you pick yourself back up?
That's a good question. You're asking hard questions. I think a lot of times I try to kind of think about, especially what I'm trying to do for my clients, and that they're not going to benefit if I'm, milquetoast and not really, acting with confidence and with some assertion on their behalf. And so, again, I want to make sure I'm right. I don't want to just say a lot of things that are completely wrong and off base because I feel so confident about it. But at the same time, it's important, even when you're kind of talking through an issue and maybe don't know for sure you have the right answer, to at least go through that process without looking like you just don't know what you're doing. And so a lot of what I do is sort of, coach myself internally and say, you know what, you've been doing this, you know the right answer, go ahead. The other part of being confident too, though, that I think it takes a while to learn when you're a professional, is that part of confidence is saying, I don't know the answer to that. And rather than just making something up or saying something that might be wrong, let me get back to you. And that's something I think I've learned to say to my clients. If they ask me a tough question, instead, again, of just making something up or trying to pretend like I know what I'm talking about, it's being able to say, I don't know, but I'll go back and I'll get you the answer to that in a little bit. And that's a skill that can take a long time to learn, because you don't want to look like you don't know what you're doing, but it undercuts you if you just say something that's wrong and have to backtrack, or somebody finds out it's wrong. It's an important skill to learn.
Definitely. It seems like being vulnerable is the right way to go in that situation.
Right.
So what role then has like asking people for help? How have you gotten more comfortable with that?
That has not been a problem, mostly for me. I mean, one of the things about going back to school, you know, in the movies, like law classes always look like they're really hard because they ask you questions and they use the Socratic method, and people are really intimidated. And when I was in the orientation for law school, you know, I was 20 years older than most of the people with me, and they were really, really scared about that. But that was not a problem for me because I'd been working for 10 years, and you will learn when you work that you will look stupid in many, many scenarios, and you get used to it. And so I didn't care. Like, you know, I'm like, fine, I'm going to answer a question wrong. It doesn't matter. You know, I also really value the views of my colleagues at work. And so having conversations on an ongoing basis to figure out where I might be wrong, what I might be missing, where somebody else may have an alternative view is critical. And so, I mean, I'm not sure if that's the same as help, but to me, that's the, you know, I don't need to be the know-it-all. What I need to do is figure out the best answer for my clients, and the best way to do that is to take advantage of kind of the brain trust of the people that I work with. So probably I err on the other side and ask people questions all the time. Maybe they're annoyed by it, but yeah, that's what I do.
That's awesome. And what advice would you give to girls who want to follow in your footsteps?
Well, I mean, so I think one lesson from my history is that don't be afraid to make a change. Like, that was probably the hardest part of it all, is going from a place where I had some authority, I had built up a reputation, and then going to a place where that didn't exist. But if you're unhappy, you don't have to just stay on a course. You can shift midstream, and it's not a disaster. The other piece of it, I think, is, you know, think about what it is that's going to be most fun for you. What do you love? Do you love like being challenged by academic questions, or do you love getting your hands dirty? Do you love, you know, doing research? These are the types of things that are going to dictate whether you love what you're doing for life. And you know, everybody has a different set of answers. If you want to go into law school, I would just suggest, you know, look at a lot of different. There are a lot of options that come out of having a law degree, and keep your brain open to those. When I even going to law school at age 40, I didn't think, oh, I want to be a securities lawyer. I couldn't have even told you what that was then. But you know. Keep open to all different paths as you're thinking ahead, because you never know which one is really going to be the one that surprisingly is yours. So.
Awesome. I want to open it up to the girls, see if you have any questions. I'll give you a minute to think. Can you tell me what's your favorite food?
I still don't have one. Cheese, probably, of all different kinds.
What about your favorite thing to do when you're stressed at work?
So I actually play in a rock band, and that's what I do for fun. And it's a really awesome outlet, because I took piano for 10 years in high school, and I was a classic pianist. And now, like 10 years ago, someone at my son's elementary school put something on the listserv and said, who wants to join a band? And a bunch of people answered. It turned out almost all of them were friends of mine already, and you know, we play in bars about 3 times a year, and we have so much fun. It's a totally different part of my brain, and I love doing it. It's really fun.
I was not expecting that, to be very honest. That's super cool. I wish my parents were that awesome.
My parents don't think it's cool. I mean, my kids don't think it's cool.
My dad reads the newspaper for fun, playing a rock band. You know. Awesome. Any questions? Yeah.
So obviously the field of law is kind of dominated by men, and so what's some like gender discrimination that you may have witnessed or faced, and how did you deal with that?
So I will say I work for a really great firm, and it's really committed to trying to combat some of the various stereotypes, and it's trying to really promote women. So at my firm, it really hasn't, I can't sort of pinpoint anything in particular. And I will say the chair of the board at our firm is a woman. This year, there were 17 people who were promoted to partner, and 10 of us were women, which is really unusual. That said, any job like being a lawyer is a service job, basically. If your clients need something, you need to be responsive to them. And so even though I said I have some control over my schedule, to a certain degree, you also have to actually be responsive or your clients will leave and go someplace else. And so that can be hard just as anybody with a family. Unfortunately, like for the most part, traditional roles mean that often the woman is doing more in a family. My husband and I don't necessarily fall into that stereotype. In fact, he's at home right now. But when we were both working, it can be really hard at 7 or 8 o'clock at night to have to do a phone call because we got to get dinner on the table or our kids are going to be starving. So that part of it is hard. And what's been great though is that one of the other pieces of being a lawyer is that nobody actually cares all that much where you're doing the work. And so I have a lot more flexibility to do work at home sometimes. I have a lot more flexibility to do calls from anywhere. And that has meant that I can go to the track meet or the swim meet and work, or I can be at home and maybe make dinner and then get on a phone call. And so the flexibility has been really critical to me, and the fact that my firm allows me to do that and my colleagues allow me to do that has been really critical. No, that's not like really a direct answer to what you asked, but I haven't seen a lot of really blatant discrimination. The hardest part has been that when you watch the trends, and this wasn't for me, but it's just one of the big problems is that a lot of young associates get married and they have children in their 20s and 30s, and then many women drop out of the workplace for a while, and that I think is a really hard thing to address structurally in a particular firm. But I think that's a lot of where the lack of progress in women's advancement has come from in the legal field and in other areas. And so my view is that as a society, we really need to be thinking creatively about gender roles and who does what, and give people flexibility so it's not always the woman that takes care of the kids and cooks and does all those things. But also we need to provide the supports from a policy perspective to allow people to have the flexibility and have supports like family leave and things like that promote both women and men. Answer your question, but I haven't felt personally a lot of discrimination since starting as a lawyer.
Yeah.
Do you find it difficult to counsel your clients without expressing a political bias? And if so, how do you refrain from doing so?
So, not really. The way that would come up most frequently sometimes I personally just talk about politics with my clients, and I would actually say that most of us are pretty simpatico, I guess, about how we think about these issues, and that's never been a particular issue. In terms of the work, though, sometimes there are policies in place that we have to say, you need to do X, otherwise you're going to be breaking the law. And the client will say, well, that's a dumb law. Like, it really bothers me. And, I could, I guess, defend the policy or not defend the policy and, express sort of political views that way. It doesn't really matter whether I think it's a good law or not because they still have to comply with it. And so that's sort of a lot of how I'll talk about it. I'll basically pass the buck to Congress or to the regulator and say, yeah, I know this rule doesn't work. I know it's really horrible for your business, but we have to figure out a way that you can do what you want to do that way. Otherwise, just in terms of day-to-day conversation, it doesn't come up that often, and when it does, most of my clients are pretty, it's a light conversation. So.
Anyone else? Yeah.
What would you say for girls entering the law, the workforce, doing law, and who are thinking of backing out? What would you say to them?
You think to go to another career, you mean?
Or
to take off?
Yeah.
Well, I would suggest strongly that they try to figure out a way to make it work, because I do think, and I know plenty of women who kind of took time out of the workforce for a while and went back and did fine. It's not that that's not an option. But I do think that, and this will betray my political views, but I actually also think that it's really important that everybody have sources of independence. And I will say this: both of my sisters right now are getting divorced, and neither of them worked, and they've been devastated financially because of that, and they're really struggling, and their ex-husbands are not helping. For me, that has just underscored, you have to have something you can fall back on. You have to be able to support yourself. You obviously do not want your marriage to end in divorce, or your partnership or anything like that, but you also need to protect yourself. You need to be in a place where you can walk away if you need to for a lot of reasons. So maybe that means part-time, maybe that means thinking about your relationship with your partner, and how you can kind of jigger that to make sure both people can work. If you don't have a spouse, that's harder, probably you have to work. But I think, try to be creative about how to keep the things, the work piece also in place.